Tonight, in that thin threshold where you feel your eyelids growing heavy, as the weary sounds of the world slowly fade away, perhaps you are unknowingly arriving at the edge of a very ancient story. Because in these deep hours of night, tales passed down through thousands of years, like a faint whisper carried by the wind, seek out a new listener. Now, if you're lying comfortably, ready to release your body and let your mind drift toward the vastness of the steppe, I want to tell you the story of Asena, but without haste, in a rhythm with no sharp edges, calm, soft, and inviting sleep, just like the slow progression of the night itself. Perhaps it's good to say this now, if these kinds of long, calm, and slow narratives relax you and lighten your mind at the end of the night. You could subscribe to the channel if you wish, of course, only if this narration truly does you good. There's no force in these things, no pressure, just an invitation, like the words of a bard who sits by the fire in ancient times telling stories. Now, if you wish, let's slowly begin walking toward Asena's story. Imagine stepping into the darkness of the steppe, the pale light of the moon gently falling upon the earth, the wind slightly bending the grasses on that thin line between night and day where only nature's deep breath can be heard. This breath has never changed for thousands of years because the steppe existed before humans and will continue to exist after humans are gone. Getting lost in this vastness is not frightening. On the contrary, it carries a peace. In a place where everything is stripped away, leaving only earth and sky, a person hears the sound of their own heart more clearly. It is from such silence that Asena's story emerges. Long ago, before calendars, years, and months were used to measure time, when people followed only nature's signs, a Turkic tribe encountered a great calamity. What exactly this calamity was remains unknown. Some say it was a merciless attack. Others claim it was the result of an unfortunate massacre. Whatever it was, only one child remained. Wounded, exhausted. A child whose breath was nearly extinguished. As the harsh cold of the steppe descended upon him in a dark night, the child perhaps thought to close his eyes for the last time, because he had no strength left to endure. The earth was cold, the sky was silent, and the wind continued to blow like an indifferent teacher. But the steppe is not as merciless as it appears. It has its own rhythm, its own justice. At that very moment, a shape emerged from the darkness, slow, silent, light as a snowflake but sharp as a shadow in movement. A wolf, a female wolf with eyes reflecting the moonlight, fur the same color as the night, taking calculated steps. This wolf was not an ordinary animal, because in her gaze was that rare expression where both wildness and compassion existed simultaneously. That wolf was Asena. Asena stood beside the child. She sniffed, sensed his breath, understood how weak he was. But when she noticed the child was still breathing, something beyond her instincts activated. A mercy, a protective instinct, perhaps the touch of destiny. And Asena gently took the child between her teeth, in a way that wouldn't hurt, with a mother's tenderness. She carried him through narrow paths, snow-covered hollows, and harsh, rocky terrain to a hidden cave. The cave's interior was dark but safe. Inside there was no wind, the cold was milder. Upon the stones was a silent warmth left by the years. Asena placed the child near the cave wall, then curled up beside him and warmed him with her breath. This moment was perhaps one of history's most silent, deepest turning points. Because in that cave's darkness, a nation's future began to be rewritten. Nights passed. Asena went outside the cave, hunted, returned. She healed the child's wounds by licking them. This was a natural and powerful method wolves used to keep their own young alive. The child's fever lasted several days. Sometimes his breath seemed to stop. Sometimes his lips dried. But Asena remained patiently by his side. On the morning after the fever broke, the child opened his eyes again. He saw the dark cave, the stone walls, and the gray fur curled up beside him. At first, he didn't understand where he was, then slowly remembered. The disaster, fire, attack, screams, and then a wolf. When he met Asena's eyes, the child strangely felt no fear, because in that gaze there was no attack, no hunger, no threat, only a heavy and calm wisdom, as if Asena was telling him he still had a place in this world, as if saying to him, "Rise, begin again." As days passed, the child grew stronger. His wounds closed, his eyes gained brightness, a slight color came to his lips. Asena taught him the rhythm of the steppe, the sounds of night, the direction of wind, the location of water, the scent of danger. But she didn't do this with words. The steppe's teaching isn't done with words anyway. Its teaching comes through silence, observation, and rhythm. The child adapted to this as well. At first, he carefully watched Asena's every movement, then slowly learned to walk with her. Understanding the language of wolves requires no words. The tilt of the body, the length of breath, the tempo of steps explain everything. Perhaps you feel a slow rhythm in the narrative up to this point. This is completely normal because this story was written for a mind preparing for sleep. If your mind has begun to relax, if your eyes are growing heavy, this rhythm is working correctly. The narrative's purpose is not to awaken you. Just as Asena drew the child into the cave's warmth, it is to slowly carry you into the story. Asena and the child ventured outside the cave more frequently over time. The steppe seemed to have accepted their walk, because the steppe loves those who adapt to its rhythm. The child was now stronger, but still felt respect when walking beside Asena. Because Asena was not merely a wolf. She was a turning point in the Turk's destiny, a guide, a mother figure. Though they appeared as just two creatures in the middle of the steppe, the meaning this pair carried was much deeper. Asena's cave was not an ordinary cave either. Over time, it became a home for the child. The soft texture of stones, a dark corner where fire took its place, the regular breath of cold air filtering through the walls. All together created a realm of peace. This peace made him forget the destruction of the outside world. At night, the child would sleep listening to Asena's breath. That breath was like the first lullaby of a nation's rebirth. And thus, a winter, a spring, a summer passed. The child became someone who could now walk alone, had learned to hunt, could recognize danger by its scent. But Asena was beside him, because this bond was no longer built only on survival, but on destiny. The child would someday be the ancestor of a great community, but he didn't know this yet. For now, all he knew was that he was safe beside Asena. As the first part of this long journey ends here, perhaps your mind has grown a bit heavier too. If you wish, let's continue the story. Perhaps this rhythm will bring you even closer to sleep. Now, if you're ready, let's continue. Time, on the steppe, is like a river flowing with patience, neither fast nor slow, only bound to its own rhythm. While the seasons passing after the light emerging from Asena's cave shaped both the child's body and spirit, the vastness of the steppe also taught him to read the world. He was no longer just a refugee. He had become someone who began to speak the language of the steppe. who could understand the signs carried by the wind. Each morning, waking beside Asena, he began to feel the darkness of nights less threatening, the infinity of days less foreign. Because the most important thing a creature growing beside someone learns is knowing they are not alone. Imagine the steppe's silent mornings, if you will. Those thin hours when the sky opens with a yellow tone near the horizon, when the wind still carries a coolness belonging to night. The child, upon waking, looks at Asena. The wolf slowly opens her eyes, first surveys the child, then listens outward, as if checking the steppe's pulse by repeating the same ritual each morning. In these mornings, there is no conversation. Words are unnecessary within silence. In their language are gazes, steps, and breaths. The child observes how Asena pauses when leaving the cave, how she adjusts her steps according to the wind's direction. The steppe doesn't love those who hurry. Everything must be done slowly. As days lengthened, the child began to understand Asena better. Asena going outside some nights, staying inside others, sometimes hunting and sometimes just circling around the cave, were at first incomprehensible behaviors for the child. But over time he realized that Asena's every step was connected to the steppe's long memory. Wolves don't move randomly. He learned how to relate a water source to approaching danger, how a wind change affected prey animals, how even the moon's intensity gave direction to nighttime behaviors. Growing beside Asena was like learning to read nature's book. The wind turns its pages, birds write its lines, and time determines its ending. Sometimes at night before sleeping, the child would look outside from the cave entrance. The moon's light cast shadows on the earth. Distant sounds of animals walking somewhere could be heard. Sometimes an owl's hiss, sometimes a jackal's delicate call. Though these sounds made him uneasy in his first months, they were now familiar sounds. Each was part of night's own song. And this song was like a soft melody inviting the child to sleep. Asena most often kept watch at the cave entrance. Her eyes were slightly narrowed, her ears sensitive to even the smallest sound. Even when the child fell into deep sleep, Asena remained awake. Because for the continuation of future generations, someone needed to stay awake that night. During one of these long periods of silence, the child began to think about why Asena was so attached to him. Because his wounds had now healed, he had learned to hunt, he was strong enough to stay in the cave alone. But Asena didn't leave. She walked with him, hunted with him, slept with him. Though this devotion appeared at first glance to be motherhood, those who knew the steppe's stories knew this had a much deeper meaning. Asena hadn't just kept a child alive, she had also kept alive the future that child carried. That's why the source of Asena's bond was not only mercy, it was destiny itself. One day the wind changed. The child didn't notice, but Asena sensed it immediately. The shapes of clouds in the sky went beyond the usual. The wind determined a new direction. There was a slight tremor in the earth. The steppe's spirit announced an approaching movement. Asena, gently pushing the child by his arm, led him out of the cave. In this push there was no haste, but there was a warning, a call to prepare. The child followed Asena's steps. When they stepped outside the cave, the steppe's infinity spread before them. As daylight met the earth, everything appeared a bit more distinct. In the distance, at a very far point, the child saw smoke rising. At first, he couldn't make sense of it, because the smoke expanded and contracted depending on the wind's direction, moving like a ghost, avoiding being seen. But the smoke's shape and its order not belonging to any other creature on the steppe pointed to something. Nearby, there were humans. The child, in that moment, felt a strange emotion, both curiosity, shiver, and perhaps a slight longing, because he hadn't seen a human face since the night of disaster. He had entrusted his voice only to the wind, his breath only to Asena. But now, the traces of human scent coming from afar opened closed doors in his mind. Asena behaved as if aware of the child's thoughts. She turned her gaze to him, then looked again toward where the smoke rose, as if sensing that the time had come to reconnect the child with the world. But she was patient. No journey on the steppe is rushed. That day they watched the smoke. The next day they began to track. Asena taught the child not how to track a predator, but how to track a human community. She showed him the marks footprints left on the earth, the scent of places where tents were set up, the distribution pattern of animal herds. The child learned humanity's signatures on the steppe. This was a new book for him, but still part of nature's silent language. During these walks, the child sometimes grew tired, but Asena never seemed to tire. Her steps belonged to the steppe. They carried a rhythm fixed by years of habit, by nature's memory. As the child followed this rhythm, his own internal rhythm also slowed. His breathing became deeper, his steps softer. This process was a natural flow, like breathing slowing before falling asleep. If you too are feeling your breath growing a bit heavier at this point, the narration's rhythm has begun to reach its purpose. Days later, finally, the silhouettes of tents appeared on the horizon. These tents stood like dark dots on the steppe. As the wind gently swayed them, smoke rose from within. When the child saw that sight, he paused for a moment, because a feeling he had long tried to forget but still lived somewhere inside him emerged. The feeling of remembering what it meant to be human. Asena noticed he had stopped but didn't force him to proceed. She knew the child needed to step toward his own destiny. Destiny is not like jumping from a cliff, it's like advancing step by step in a river. With each step, the water rises a bit more, cools a bit more, but doesn't drown. As they approached the area where the tents were located, human voices began to be heard from afar. The child had forgotten these sounds. Human laughter, animal sounds, the hollow beat of a distant drum. All of these felt both foreign and familiar to him. Asena was silent. In this silence was acceptance. She had accepted that the time for the child's return to his own kind was approaching. But this return didn't mean separation, because Asena's role was not only to keep the child alive, but to show him a path he could walk, and only time would determine where this path led. When the child came near the tents, people noticed him. At first they were cautious, because the story of a child wandering alone on the steppe usually bore traces of disaster. But when they saw Asena standing behind him, they experienced an emotion between astonishment and admiration. Because all steppe communities knew that if a wolf protected a human, that human was not ordinary. This was a sign given by nature. A child, followed by Asena, might carry great things in his destiny. The child was taken into a tent. People gave him water, food, and rest. But the child constantly turned his eyes toward where the cave was. Asena watched them from afar. She didn't stand beside him, didn't approach, because now the child needed to learn to walk. Still, she didn't leave. She behaved like a guardian wanting to be sure the child settled in. In the child's eyes was gratitude. This gratitude was the result of a bond too deep for language to express. Asena watched the child from afar for several days. Then one morning, as the sun was just rising, she turned her direction toward a deeper place on the steppe. She walked slowly. The child saw her but didn't follow. because he now knew the steppes' language. Asena's farewell was silent but powerful. In that moment, the child understood that destiny had offered him a path. He would live among humans, but would never forget anything he learned on the steppe. The strength he received from Asena would be the wisdom that would later enable him to lead his ancestors. This slow and calm separation was not the end of a story, but rather the beginning of a new story. The child's union with the human community was the starting step of the Turks' multiplication. Asena disappeared into the steppe's infinity, but her traces continued to live in that child's veins. Because the steppe's spirit, once it touches a creature, never withdraws, and thus the second act of the rebirth that began under Asena's guidance also makes its own silent closing. Now, if you wish, pause a moment, breathe, feel the heaviness of your eyes. The story's rhythm continues to slow, just like the night deepening. If you're ready, we can move to the next chapter of this silent journey. As the steppe's vastness opened toward the center of the child's new life, this young soul beginning to reunite with humans in the shadow of Asena's teaching, began to find more space for himself with each passing day. People walking among the tents initially watched him with curiosity, because a lone child raised by a wolf was not an ordinary story for steppe people. For these people who valued nature's signs, such an event carried a sanctity coming from time's depths. In the child's walk was Asena's shadow, in his gaze the steppe's silent wisdom, in his posture the resolute simplicity of wolves. As people noticed this, they looked at him with a different eye, both with respect and a bit of distance, because they believed someone chosen by nature was not like an ordinary human. Each morning the child woke. When he opened the tent door, he felt the wind touch his face. This touch was like a greeting he'd known since cave days. The wind sometimes came from the north, sometimes from the east, but whenever it blew, the child seemed to hear somewhere in that breeze Asena's breath, as if somewhere far away, that wise wolf wandering in the steppe's shadow still watched him. This feeling gave him both confidence and mental clarity. Even while growing among humans, he felt that nature's rhythm never disappeared. The human community taught the child new things: how to make fire burn stronger, how to harden arrow tips, how to tie knots in ropes, how to direct animal herds. But all this knowledge, in the child's eyes, was not as fundamental as what Asena taught. Because Asena had taught him life's core: silence, observation, waiting for the right moment, aligning with flow. The bustle of humans sometimes seemed too fast to him. Horses neighing, tents being set up and taken down, the rush of daily tasks. All of it was a bit too noisy for the steppe's natural rhythm. Still, the child slowly adapted to this world, because within him was the steppe's patience. One morning, one of the community's elders called the child to his side. This elder was someone with a white beard reaching to his chest, deep lines on his face, eyes reflecting the knowledge of years. When the child first saw him, he sensed something familiar behind his eyes, just like the wisdom carried by Asena's silence. The old man gazed at the child for a long time, looked into his eyes, and then spoke in a voice resembling the wind's direction. "You are not an ordinary child," he said. "One who grows among wolves carries the steppe's spirit within. This spirit is a sign for the future. Your path will be open, but only time will show where this path leads." Though the child didn't fully understand these words, he sensed a sincerity, a truth in the elder's eyes. This conversation remained in his mind, and he often thought about it before sleeping at night. because a person's destiny, like the steppe drawing its own river, shapes itself spontaneously, but all lines have a beginning. This beginning began to take shape slowly in the child's heart. Over time, the child mingled more into the community. He hunted with people, sat by the fire, listened to their old stories. Among these stories were creation epics, tales of heroism, narratives of ancestors' spirits ascending to the sky. However, the child realized that among all these stories, the one most foreign to him came from humans, because his first story had begun with a wolf's warm breath. Though the things people told were interesting, in the deepest place of the child's memories were Asena's cave, the redness of fire, and the steppe's night scent. As the child grew, those around him began to notice his leadership qualities. He walked slowly, but with determined steps. When he spoke, he didn't use many words, but the things he said were heavy and meaningful. These qualities were highly valued in steppe communities, because a leader's most important quality was not to hurry, to act thoughtfully. The child's calmness was a natural result of being raised by someone who spent years in silence. A new respect began to form among the people. Despite his youth, they listened to him. Sometimes one of them would look into his eyes when making a decision, try to read the expression on his face, because even before becoming a leader, the child was seen as someone carrying the steppe's wisdom. One day, the community decided to migrate. Steppe people lived in constant movement, because the grasses provided by the land changed places according to seasons. During these migration preparations, the child felt for the first time an emotion similar to his own past. People moving collectively, horses running, tents being dismantled and quickly packed. All of these reminded him of that old disaster. A darkness appeared within him, but immediately after he sensed a familiar scent brought by the wind. This was Asena's scent. He turned his eyes to the horizon, but even when he couldn't see any wolf, the presence of that scent calmed the storm within him. Because Asena's spirit was everywhere on the steppe. If the wind was blowing, she was there too. During the migration, the child walked at the front of the community. This wasn't his decision. People wanted him to be there. In their eyes, having someone chosen by nature walk ahead was considered good fortune. The child, while looking toward the steppe's vastness, remembered the paths Asena once walked. Long steps, calm breath, an attentive mind. These memories shaped his steps too. As people followed his walk, they unknowingly aligned with the steppe's rhythm, because the child's rhythm came from the steppe. During the migration days, the child sometimes distanced himself a bit from the community to be alone. These withdrawals didn't disturb anyone, because most people thought he retreated to nature, refreshed the strength he brought to the community there. One late afternoon, at an hour when the sun drew a golden line on the steppe, the child climbed to the top of a distant hill. While watching the steppe from there, the sky slowly turned purple, the wind lightened, the earth began to release the day's last warmth. In this moment, the child took a deep breath and felt the steppe's breath within himself. When he closed his eyes, a silhouette appeared from within the darkness. Wolf, Asena. Just like on the night of disaster, but this time not beside the child, appearing in his memory. Though the child saw he was alone when he opened his eyes, the reality of the feeling Asena left him didn't change. When the migration was completed, the community settled in its new place. This place was near the foothills of mountains. Water sources were abundant. Grasses were fresh. It was a suitable area for animal herds. As people set up their tents, The child again became the most consulted person in the community. Elders showed him respect. Youth tried to learn from him. Though the child still didn't fully understand the reason for this value given to him, he tried not to disappoint people's trust in him. Because one of the most important lessons he learned from Asena was this: strength is a trust that must be carried silently. One night, while listening to the stories people told by the fire, the child fell into deep silence. As people told of heroes, victories, great leaders, the child remembered the cave where his own story began. The crackling of fire reminded him of the small flames burning in the cave. As people's voices slowly receded to the background, the child descended into a silence deep enough to hear his own breath. In this silence, the steppe's spirit touched him once more. This touch ignited a new fire within him. Now he knew where he belonged. He was human, but he was the steppe's child. He was part of the community, but he was nature's heir. On this night of awareness, as the child looked into the distance, two small lights appeared in the darkness. Like a pair of eyes, light mixed with night, but making its presence felt. The child couldn't tell if they were Asena because the eyes disappeared in an instant, but the feeling passing through him at that moment was that the invisible face of this world was as real as its visible face. The steppe's spirit didn't always show itself to humans, but it never left those it touched alone. As the community began to strengthen in this new region, people realized the child was now a young man. His height had grown, his gaze had deepened, on his face had formed a determination coming from Asena's silence. When he spoke, his voice was calm, just like the wind caressing the grasses. This calmness inspired trust among people. One day, the elders called him to their side and asked him to become one of the community's new leaders. The child was surprised, because he still saw himself as the wounded child in Asena's cave. But when the elders looked into his eyes and said, "The steppe has chosen you. The wolf raised you. It is your destiny to be our leader." These words settled the heavy stones within the child. This was why Asena had brought him among humans. Though he was raised by a wolf, he was sent to be a leader among humans. This destiny had begun to take shape years ago in the cave's darkness. Thus, the child became the young leader of the steppe people. With his walk, his decisions, his words, and his silence, he began to give direction to the community. But in every decision, in every step, in every thought, he felt Asena's shadow. Because leadership was not only managing people, it was aligning with nature's rhythm. And what raised a nation was not only the power of the sword, but nature's wisdom. As this chapter slowly ends here, perhaps your breath has grown a bit heavier, your mind a bit more blurred. If you wish, we'll continue this long journey in the next chapter. The night's rhythm is slowing. So is the story. Within the steppe's silent order, shaped by time, the young leader's steps were now determining his people's paths. But he listened to another voice within him in every decision. This voice was sometimes heard like a faint hum of wind, sometimes felt like the shadow of a pair of eyes in night's darkness, sometimes echoed in that deep vibration reaching his knees when stepping on the earth. This was Asena's voice, not made of words, but a guidance carried by the steppe's own breath. Once the young man heard this guidance, he never lost it again, because when destiny speaks from within a person, its voice is never forgotten. As days progressed with the order of seasons, the community grew stronger each passing day. The region where they newly settled was in the mountain's shadow, so it was both sheltered and had wide pastures. Animal herds were multiplying. Children were growing in number. Elders were finding a peace they hadn't felt in many years. And at the center of all this order was the young leader, because the people knew deep down that someone raised by a wolf could not only see the world, but could also hear the world's silent face. Their trust in his decisions was also a natural flow because of this. But the silence within the young leader wasn't always full of peace. Some nights he would go outside the tent, watch the dark silhouettes of mountains, observe the heavy movement of stars. During these times a thought would trouble his mind. Where was Asena now? Would he ever see her again? As a leader, he could guide people but might not be able to fill the emptiness within himself. Because Asena had become not just a wolf figure in his heart, but a mother, a teacher, a destiny marker. Her absence made him feel both strength and a kind of loneliness. One night, at a time when the wind blew gently but meaningfully, when the young leader stepped out of his tent, he saw the moon brighter than normal. A thin light was spreading over the steppe. Small silver dots were shining on the tips of grasses. This brightness made everything in the night more distinct and defined, as if the world had clarified its lines for a moment. As the young leader walked under this light, he saw a form moving a few meters beyond the shadow. At first, he thought it was an illusion, because that form carried a silhouette he had brought to life 1,000 times in his mind. Thin, long, powerful, and silent steps. A wolf. The young leader stopped for a moment. His heart didn't speed up, only its rhythm changed, just like a drum remembering an old story and shifting to another measure. The wolf shadow became a bit more distinct. It didn't come toward him, nor did it retreat. It just stopped and waited. At that moment, the young leader understood it was Asena. After a while, the wolf's eyes sparkled in the moonlight. This sparkle was no different from those eyes he saw in the cave, reflecting the fire. Within it was both warmth and a call. The young leader wanted to step forward, but the wolf silhouette slowly retreated and merged with the steppe's darkness, as if it wanted to show it had come but wouldn't allow him to approach. This encounter left a deep mark in the young leader's mind. Asena had returned, but not as a mother, like a sign, like a warning, like a direction pointer. The young leader couldn't sleep that night. Within him was a movement, a call. Asena's appearance couldn't be for nothing, because nothing on the steppe was without reason. The wind didn't randomly choose where to blow. A wolf wouldn't appear at just any moment. This encounter was the beginning of a new period for the young leader. The next day, when the morning sun rose, the community sensed an unease. Animals were unusually tense. Horses were breathing faster than normal in the morning silence. Dogs were constantly checking the air's scent. Even birds were drawing unusual circles above the tents. This break in nature's balance clearly indicated that the wolf he saw was a harbinger. From that day on, the young leader began to watch the steppe's signs more carefully, because there was news carried by the wind. This news emerged clearly days later. From a distant region, signs were coming that another tribe was mobilizing. This tribe had been heading toward other lands for a long time due to hunger, disease, and land scarcity. On the steppe, one tribe being carried while another tribe dispersed was a normal cycle, but this tribe's way of migrating was dangerous. Desperation had made them aggressive. It was said they plundered animal herds, attacked tents, took women and children captive. The steppe's spirit didn't love such movements, because everything that disrupted order would overflow the earth's patience. When the young leader received this news, what passed through him wasn't fear. The voice within him had echoed on the night Asena was seen. This was a warning, a call to prepare, because a leader's duty was not only to manage his people, but also to protect their future. The young leader gathered his people together. He told them about the approaching danger, but didn't do so with frightening words, rather with a calm style built on not disrupting nature's order. Because a leader doesn't spread panic and scatter his community. He reminds them of the right rhythm. During this speech, he paused for a moment, took a breath, and, if these kinds of narratives gave them strength, enabled them to protect each other and stay strong, he said they could come together and make common decisions if they wished. This short sentence was like a CTA, but it was very soft, spoken in a tone that didn't force, just offered an invitation. The people accepted this invitation, because the young leader's voice was as calm and reassuring as the steppe itself. The community's elders, warriors, and women came together and had long discussions. The young leader allowed everyone to speak in these discussions, because on the steppe, everyone's voice is part of the wind. What keeps a community standing is not only leaders' words, but the people's common breath. A strategy was determined in these meetings. The community would strengthen its defense, send reconnaissance groups, and try to understand the approaching tribe's intentions. They would fight when necessary, but the first goal was to preserve peace, because the steppe's cycle existed not with war, but with balance. The young leader wanted to join the reconnaissance groups. The people initially opposed this, but when he said he would understand the steppe's language best, everyone was convinced. Because reading nature's signs was a much more valuable skill than warfare. A few days later, the leader and a small team set out northward. This journey began with a silence that reminded the young leader of his childhood. There was no haste between steps, because to hear the steppe's breath, one must not hurry. During their travels, they noticed certain signs of nature. In some places, the tips of grasses seemed burned. In some places, animal tracks had dug into the earth as if running in panic. This was the silent but chilling trace that the approaching tribe left everywhere they passed. As the young leader saw these signs, an unease rose within him. The reason for Asena's warning was now appearing more clearly. One day, the wind began to blow hard. The leader took the group up to a hill. When they looked down from the hill, they saw smoke rising in a distant valley. The smoke was not from tents, but from burning pastures. This was an indication of the approaching tribe's desperation and anger. This scene left a heaviness in the young leader's heart, because if the steppe's order was disrupted, everyone would be harmed. They had to act to preserve balance. When the young leader and his team returned, the people were waiting for them. The community understood that the approaching danger was real the moment they saw the expression on the young leader's face. He gathered the people and told them what happened in a calm tone. There was no fear in his voice, only serious determination. This determination also passed into the people's hearts. The community didn't abandon their leader. No one thought of fleeing. No one panicked. Because those who trust in the steppe's spirit also trust in nature's justice. Preparations lasted for days. Earth defenses were built. Animals were moved to safe areas. Children and elders were gathered in a protected zone. Throughout this process, the young leader walked among the people. He spoke with each person, looked into each one's eyes. He gave them not courage, but peace. Because peace is fear's antidote. A community that could preserve peace in the steppe's heart couldn't make any external threat an unshakable shield for itself. While all these preparations were being made, the young leader would still be alone at night. One of the nights, while standing at the foot of the mountains, he heard a howl from afar. This howl belonged to Asena, that wise, deep voice that filled a person's interior with calmness. When the young leader heard this sound, a confidence formed in his heart. Asena was there. She was in the steppe's shadow. While he prepared to protect his people, she was accompanying him too. The young leader closed his eyes and imagined Asena's breath. Within this imagination he felt again that night he lived in the cave years ago. The fire's warmth, the wolf's breath, the earth's scent. At that moment he understood that leadership wasn't only fighting or managing. Actually, most of all, it meant protecting his people's spirit, keeping them in the steppe's rhythm, uniting them with nature's breath. As nights passed like this, the approaching tribe's migration columns finally became visible. The dust clouds rising on the horizon were the silent signs of approaching danger. This scene placed a heavy responsibility on the young leader's heart, but there was no fear within, only a feeling of readiness. Because the steppe's children don't panic in the face of threat. They listen to the wind's direction, read the sky's color, trust time's flow. As this chapter slowly ends here, perhaps your body has relaxed a bit more, your eyes have grown a bit heavier. The story will continue to progress slowly in accordance with the night's rhythm. If you're ready, we'll continue the journey. While the dust clouds rising on the steppe's horizon became a bit more distinct with each passing day, the young leader noticed the silence within him gradually deepening. Because every day, every new sign, every new wind direction made the weight of the approaching tribe a bit more palpable, suggesting there would be a break in the steppe's ancient order. As the young leader heard the slight anxiety emerging in people's eyes, the restlessness of animals, and the strange tremor carried by the wind, he began to better understand why Asena had appeared. This was news, but not news carrying fear. It was news requiring preparation, awareness, and awakening. Because the steppe never brought only danger. Sometimes it brought a test of strength, sometimes the threshold of transformation. The community had been preparing for days, but this preparation wasn't done with war cries. It was a silent, calm, but determined preparation befitting the steppe person's nature. Wide circles were being drawn around the tents. Invisible traps were being placed at entry points. Food stores were being strengthened at the community's center. Sheltered areas were being built for women and children. Throughout this process, the young leader went over each preparation many times, without rushing anyone, without pressuring anyone, just keeping the community's rhythm standing with his presence. The steppe's nights felt different during this period. Moonlight appeared colder, stars sharper, as if even the sky was watching the approaching storm, witnessing time's heavy flow. One of these nights, when the young leader stepped out of his tent, he heard a hum within the silence. This hum wasn't the sound of wind. It was more like a vibration rising from the steppe's depths. When he bent down and placed his hand on the ground, it was as if there was a liveliness underground. This liveliness could be the approaching tribe's movement, but the young leader sensed not only human footsteps in this vibration, but the presence of something else, like nature's warning, like the echo of Asena's breath mixed with earth. The next morning, before sunrise, a reconnaissance group returned. They were tired, with fine lines on their faces blown by the wind and the weight of days without sleep in their eyes. When the young leader listened to them, he understood the situation had reached a point of no return. The approaching tribe wasn't just migrating people. Among them were warriors who had lost their order, angry leaders, herd owners blinded by hunger. These people weren't looking for land. They were like a herd consuming everything they found as they advanced. To stop this advance, defense alone wouldn't suffice. Wisdom, timing, and correctly reading nature's signs were needed. The young leader gathered the community inside the wide circle. Even children participated silently in this meeting, because everyone intuitively sensed something was changing. When the young leader began to speak, his voice was as calm as always, but equally deep. Each of his words carried a tranquility competing with the steppe's wind. He told them again about the approaching danger, but not in a tone that would create fear. He did it in a voice that informed, prepared, gave confidence. Because at the foundation of sleep-inducing stories is this: slowing the rhythm, calming the mind, relaxing the heart. At one point, he added a brief pause to his speech and said, if they wanted to continue this journey together, within the same breath, they needed to watch each other closely, to move together. This sentence was like a soft CTA, only an invitation, a call for unity. Confidence formed in people's eyes, because the young leader's voice was heavier, more real than the dust clouds outside. On the last night of preparations, the young leader was alone again. This time, he didn't walk behind the mountains, but among the tents. He saw a confidence mixed with sleep on people's faces. Families huddled together, children fallen asleep on their mothers' laps, elders swaying gently in front of the fire, bodies mixing with the steppe's rhythm. As the young leader watched this scene, he felt a heavy but peaceful weight in his heart. These people trusted him. Their trust resembled the warm breath Asena once extended to him, a breath that protected, sheltered, enveloped. When stars multiplied and night transformed its body into silver fabric, the young leader climbed one of the hills and watched the distance. The dust clouds on the horizon were now clearer. The approaching tribe was very close. The wind's direction changed, and a familiar sound rose from the steppe's depths. A howl, a call, Asena's voice. This howl wasn't alone, as if all the steppe's spirits had breathed at the same time. When the young leader heard this sound, he closed his eyes and synchronized his breath with the wind. His heart's rhythm grew heavier. Thoughts in his mind slowed. Upon him was an invisible but powerful feeling of protection. When morning came, with the first lights falling on the steppe, a light brown haze was seen in the sky. This haze had mixed with the approaching tribe's dust. The young leader organized his people. Everyone knew their place. The preparations made for days were now making sense. The defense line formed silently. Warriors dispersed invisibly among tents. Women moved to the central area with their children. The young leader stood at the front. Behind him was his people. Before him the steppe's vastness. As the wind's sound slowly increased, black dots appeared within the dust clouds. These dots gradually grew and took shape. Horsemen, hundreds. Not fast, not hasty, but a herd approaching with determined steps. This was the moment when time slowed. The steppe's breath seemed to have stopped. The young leader took a deep breath, and a strength rose from below his knees upward. This strength was familiar, warm, not the gods' or humans' strength, but nature's strength. As the two communities approached each other, the young leader gave a signal. This signal wasn't a war signal. It was a signal to wait, watch, and see the right moment. Because the steppe's language doesn't love those who hurry. It protects those who are patient. When the approaching tribe leader's face became visible, the young leader saw not anger, but desperation in his eyes. This desperation explained everything. They weren't aggressive. They were only a scattered, fragmented community that had lost its way. This moment was the moment that shaped the young leader's destiny. Either he would push this community outside the steppe and a great war would break out, or he would slowly readjust a scale, standing in balance. The young leader thought of Asena's shadow, her calmness, the silence in the caves, her howl mixed with wind. This howl was the call not of war, but of order. The young leader stepped forward, dismounted from his horse, and raised both hands openly to the side. This movement wasn't attack, wasn't surrender. It was the movement of peace, of listening, of intuition. When the approaching tribe's leader saw this movement, he stopped. He dismounted from his horse. The two leaders came face to face in the middle of the steppe, inside an invisible circle drawn by the wind. They didn't speak. For a while, they just listened to each other's breath. Because on the steppe, sometimes words become burden. Silence opens the door to understanding. The young leader was the first to speak. His voice was calm, heavy, and deep. "Do you hear what the earth is saying?" he said. This sentence was more than a question for steppe people. It was a call, a warning, a door to awareness. The opposing leader was silent for a while, then slowly bowed his head. An unexpected softening formed in his eyes, because in the young leader's voice was not false strength, but real nature wisdom. This wisdom carried the trace of a wolf's breath. This trace was the kind that steppe people could never resist. The two leaders sat for a long conversation. Warriors took a step back. The wind lightened. Even birds stopped flying. The steppe seemed to be waiting for the outcome of this meeting. The young leader learned about the opposing community's situation. Diseases, hunger, water scarcity, directionlessness. These people had once been a strong tribe, but fate had torn them apart. The young leader thought of the steppe's cycle. Sometimes one tribe rises, sometimes one falls, but those who truly fall are those who know how to stand up again. At the end of the meeting, the two leaders shook hands. This handshake wasn't ordinary. It was a peace agreement, an acceptance, and a common promise given to the steppe's order. The young leader knew this tribe wouldn't live here, but he could provide them safe passage, give them a corridor where they could gather their herds and continue on their way. This decision protected the people, protected the steppe, protected order. When the people saw war hadn't broken out, they took a deep breath. Children's faces brightened. The burden on women's shoulders lifted. Elders listened to the wind and felt the steppe was pleased, because nature loved not war, but balance. That night, the young leader walked alone into the distance. The moon was bright again. A howl rose under the sky. Asena's voice. This time it wasn't alone, as if dozens of wolves were breathing at the same time with her. As the young leader listened to these sounds, he closed his eyes and a deep peace passed through him. This was the peace of being on the right path, the path chosen by Asena. In the night's heavy darkness, the young leader sat on the ground. When he closed his eyes, the wind caressed his hair, the earth's scent filled his nose, and the steppe's ancient breath surrounded him. Within him, a weight slowly descended. But this weight wasn't fatigue. It was that sweet, safe, warm weight calling to sleep, just like his first night in a wolf's cave. As the steppe's silence deepened, the young leader breathed heavily. Each breath relaxed a bit more. Each breath brought him a bit closer to sleep. As the story slowly closes here, perhaps your eyes, too, have grown heavy. You've begun to hear a silence among the sounds. If you want to sleep, the steppe gives you permission. as the silence the steppe had kept for long years deepened in the young leader's inner world, marking a new era. After that great encounter that ended in peace, a completely different flow had begun in the life of the community. Now, the people were moving forward not only under the leadership of a leader, but also under the guidance of nature itself. The young leader felt that maintaining balance on the steppe was perhaps a greater power than winning a war, because war saved a day, balance saved a lifetime. This was exactly what Asena had taught him, not to bear power, but to release power at the right time. As days followed one another, the community became increasingly peaceful. The horses calmed, the herds multiplied, children's laughter once again surrounded the tents. For the first time in a long while, people began to sleep safely at night. Even the wind blew more gently, as if the steppe itself was taking a deep breath. As the young leader watched his people in the midst of all this flow, he felt the emptiness within him slowly filling. The child in Asena's shadow had now become a person who directed the rhythm of the steppe. But this transformation had not erased the wolf spirit within him. On the contrary, it had made it even more distinct. One morning, when the sun had just risen above the horizon, the young leader woke and went outside to feel a slight coolness in the air. The earth had begun to release the moisture accumulated overnight, and with each step, a fine mist rose from beneath the feet. This sight was a rare beauty the steppe showed, and as the young leader watched this scene, a deep peace passed through him. Just then, he noticed movement in the distance. A small black dot appeared near the horizon. This dot slowly grew, and after a while, a rider's silhouette emerged. The young leader was not surprised, because the rhythm of the steppe whispered such news in advance. The newcomer was not unexpected. Fate seemed to have written every step on the earth beforehand. When the rider approached, his face seemed familiar. He was one of the young warriors of the tribe they had met during the peace negotiations. This young man was quiet, level-headed, and honest. When the young leader went out to meet him, the rider immediately dismounted and gave his greeting. His voice was tired, but the news he carried was solid. The tribe they had made peace with had continued on their way. However, the problems they left behind had not yet been completely resolved. Some small groups from among them had scattered in disarray and had begun looting. This situation was both troubling the migrating tribe and creating new unrest on the steppe. The young leader listened to this news calmly. A feeling of responsibility arose within him, not anger, because protecting the order of the steppe did not only mean protecting his own people, it meant being able to maintain flow throughout the entire steppe. The young leader remembered that simple sentence Asena had taught him. Balance is not only the burden of the strong, but of those who can understand. This sentence echoed in a corner of his mind, and his decision became clear. The next day, he formed a small scouting party. In this team were a few warriors he trusted, and a few young people who could read the steppe well. He himself would be at the head of the team. The people were not surprised by this decision, because the most fitting thing for the young leader's nature was movement itself. He had grown up as someone who breathed not among the tents, but upon the earth. When they set out, the steppe was again wide, silent, and patient. The wind had changed direction, blowing lightly from the north, becoming a companion to the journey. The young leader listened to the sound of the earth with every step. Even the grasses crushed under the horse's hooves were telling him something. During the journey, the group heard the different sounds of the steppe one by one. The uncertain flights of distant birds, the faster than normal movements of wild sheep, the earth speaking with a lighter tremor at certain points. All of these were signs of something approaching. On the morning of the third day, the group reached a low hill above a valley. When they looked down from there, they saw smoke rising. This smoke was the trace of recently burned fires. The young leader dismounted from his horse and carefully examined the signs in the valley. Around the fires were disorderly traces, human footprints, horse tracks, dragged loads, scattered belongings. These were not the traces of a community traveling in peace. They were also not the traces of an organized army. Rather, they showed the passage of an unruly, directionless, angry group. As they followed the tracks, the sun began to set. The sky slowly turned from red to purple, from purple to deep blue. As night fell, they saw a small fire burning in the middle of the valley. As the young leader approached, he noticed 3 people sitting by the fire. The clothes on them were worn, their faces exhausted and hard. The warrior closest to him leaned toward the young leader's ear and whispered, "These could be part of that group." The young leader nodded, but did not make a hasty decision, because on the steppe no face could be understood at first glance. True intention was revealed through silence. They went down. The 3 people by the fire flinched when they saw the young leader but did not attack. The young leader walked to them and sat quietly across from the fire. For a while, no one spoke. Only the crackling of the fire could be heard. Even in this silence, the young leader felt the brokenness within them. They carried not the scent of ambition, but of directionlessness. After a while, one of the men spoke. His voice was hard, but there was deep fatigue in it. "We didn't want to harm anyone," he said. "But we were hungry, we got sick, we scattered. No one wanted us. We just tried to move forward." The young leader looked at the fire. The movements of the flames were slowly illuminating the thoughts in his mind. It was clear that these people were dangerous, but it was also clear that they were desperate. At that moment, that first night in Asena's cave appeared in his mind again. The burning fire, the smell of embers, the silence of the cave, and Asena's breath. A wolf's choice to keep a child alive. The young leader thought at that moment, "Nature showed me mercy. Now it's my turn." He had a long conversation with the men. He told them about the order of the steppe, why such movements harmed other tribes, but also that this order held a chance for them too. If they wanted to move together, he said he could find a suitable and safe path for them through the steppe. This sentence was like a CTA again. It was calling them to a decision, but not imposing pressure. It was only pointing out the path, leaving the choice on their shoulders. The men listened carefully to the young leader's words. The hardness in their eyes began to soften. The anger within them began to dissolve. Because steppe people immediately recognized the inner voice. Nature taught how to distinguish between false power and true wisdom. And the young leader's voice carried that true wisdom tone. After a while, all 3 men agreed. The young leader included them in the team. This decision could be risky, but the spirit of the steppe sometimes created new orders from within risk. The group continued on their way together for several days. During the journey, the young leader tried to gather the scatteredness within these people. He showed them how to burn fire more efficiently, how to read tracks, how to understand the change in weather from the scent of animals. Every night when they sat around the fire, the young leader noticed them gradually calming down, falling into deeper sleep, the tension in their bodies loosening. It was as if the steppe was also drawing them into its own rhythm. the gentle crackling of the fire, the soft breeze of the wind, and the young leader's calm voice were slowly calming the storm within them. One night, when everyone had fallen asleep, the young leader raised his head to the sky. The stars were very bright. It was as if the oldest spirits of the steppe were watching this journey. At that moment, he heard a faint howl, distant but very familiar, Asena's voice. The young leader closed his eyes and felt a heavy but peaceful tremor passing through him, spreading through his body. This howl was like an approval, as if Asena was saying, "You're doing right." When morning came, the young leader woke with a clearer path than he had ever felt before. A voice within him said that this journey was not just about saving a few men. This was a test that determined the steppe's leader, the steppe's future. Because nature showed different faces to the human heart to understand whether one could bear the responsibility placed upon it. Power, fear, compassion, patience. The young leader had passed all of them through himself. At the end of their journey, they directed the three men to a safe area. This area was close to the main group's transit route of the migrating tribe. When the young leader turned to look at them one last time, he saw gratitude and a sense of rebirth in their eyes. This feeling had left a heavy but sweet warmth in the leader's heart. The return journey was calmer. The wind of the steppe had lightened. The air had become clearer. The young leader sensed the smell of the earth more deeply throughout the journey. Even the rhythm in his horse's steps was softer. It was as if the steppe, after passing this test, had recognized and accepted him. When they returned to the community, the people greeted them with joy. The young leader did not tell them too many details, because true wisdom was sometimes not telling, but showing. When the people saw the tranquility in their leader's eyes, they understood everything. That night, the young leader wanted to walk alone. He passed among the tents and went out into the openness of the steppe. The moon had risen. A silver curtain had spread over the steppe. Another howl was heard from the distance, this time closer, more distinct. As the young leader listened to this sound that penetrated to the depths of his heart, he felt his knees trembling slightly. As close as a breath, but as far as a dream. He closed his eyes. The wind blew gently, and at that moment a shadow appeared. Asena, not like a real silhouette, like a spirit shaped by the wind. Her eyes glowed slowly in the moonlight. The young leader held his breath. Time stopped. The steppe fell silent. Asena took a step, and the wind caressed the young leader's face. This was the touch he had longed for years. Asena did not speak, but the young leader heard everything. The rhythm of the earth, the breath of the steppe, the direction of his fate. And at that moment, the young leader fell to his knees, because he understood. This path was not yet finished. In fact, the most important part was just beginning. As the story gently wraps around you up to here, perhaps your eyelids have grown heavy, your breathing rhythm has matched the steppe's own order, and your body has loosened a bit more. If sleep is calling you, you can allow it, because the steppe loves those who sleep. The mornings of the steppe always looked the same, wide, silent, cool, and like a slowly awakening breath. But after Asena's silhouette appeared before the young leader that night, it was as if the entire steppe had begun to pass through an invisible change. The wind blew more softly, the earth smelled deeper, the sky seemed wider. The young leader knew that this change did not belong only to nature. The steppe was whispering that a decision was approaching. This decision would determine his fate, direct his people's future, and bring to completion the path Asena had begun years ago. As he walked among the tents in the morning, he sensed a curiosity mixed with peace on people's faces. It was as if everyone had become aware of something approaching, but had not yet been able to name it. This feeling was very common in the instincts of steppe people, because they could feel even the slightest change in the wind, hear even the faintest whisper in the earth's voice. But this time what was heard was not a whisper. It was a call, a deep, heavy, and slow call. The young leader walked among the community throughout the day. He made sure everyone was well. Preparations were continuing. Communication with the pacified tribes was maintained. But no matter how much he talked with people, his mind kept sticking on the image from the night. Asena had told him something, but not with words. That's why it was taking time to understand. Throughout the day, he tried to read the signs of the steppe. The number of birds had decreased. This was always an indication of an approaching change. The horses were not restless, but carried an unusual silence. The wind, however, was blowing not from the north, but from the west. The west wind always brought a story with it. As the young leader tried to piece all these signs together, the intuition within him was forming a heavy prediction about what would happen at night. When the sun set, the steppe was covered with a dark blue curtain. Children retreated to their tents. Fires were lit. Women made their final preparations. Elders listened to the wind in silence. The young leader watched that brief calm before people passed into sleep. In these moments, the breath of the steppe became most distinct. Every sound slowed. Every shadow appeared more clearly. In the midst of this silence, the young leader slowly went outside the community. The people did not notice, because his solitary walks on the steppe were a familiar situation. But this time his walk was not an ordinary walk. With every step, it was as if an invisible force was calling him somewhere, like a corridor, like a path, like an invisible trace drawn within the earth. As he walked, the sound of the wind began to change. At first it was a gentle hum, then it deepened and seemed to turn into a breath. The rhythm of this breath was the rhythm he had remembered for years, Asena's breath. When the young leader climbed onto a small hill, the moonlight cast a wide silver shadow on the steppe. In this shadow, a movement that was invisible moments before appeared. A shadow, a silhouette, a wolf, Asena. This time clearer, more distinct, more real. The young leader felt as if his breath had been cut off, but his heart filled not with fear, but with a familiar warmth. Asena slowly approached. As her steps touched the earth, it was as if the heart of the steppe was beating with her. The young leader knelt down. Asena stopped. A deep silence formed between them. This silence was the same as that first night in the cave, but at the same time completely different. Back then, Asena had chosen him to save a child's life. Now she had returned to shape a leader's fate. As Asena's eyes calmly reflected the moonlight, the young leader suddenly felt something rising from within, a wisdom, an awareness, a flow of past and future. Asena did not speak, but the young leader was hearing. A voice within, a wordless guidance, was echoing, "Now." Even this single word was enough to open the door of fate. When the young leader raised his head and looked into Asena's eyes, forgotten stories began to come alive in the depths of his mind. The ancient ancestors of the steppe, migrating spirits, the voices of lost tribes, the breath of nature, the memory of the sky. All came together to form a great picture. At the center of this picture was one thing, the young leader himself, because he was not just a leader, he was a beginning, a lineage, the rebirth of a people. He was the bearer who would shape the next age of the steppe. At that moment, the young leader leaned forward slightly on his knees. The wind caressed his face. Asena took another step closer. Her breath touched the young leader's forehead. This contact completed the final bond that had been awaited for years. When the young leader closed his eyes, an unshakable power, a calmness, and deep knowledge rose from within him. He realized that his fate was no longer alone, that nature had united with him. Asena withdrew. One step, then another step. The silhouette slowly dispersed in the wind. A final howl rose. This howl did not tear through the night. It merged with the night. The young leader stayed on his knees for a while longer. This moment was one of the oldest rituals of the steppe, and he stood at the very center of that ritual. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer alone. Even the silence within him had changed. When he returned, the community was sleeping. Among the tents, fires were about to go out, but the young leader saw Asena's trace in the embers of every fire. As the heavy silence of the night wrapped around him, even his footsteps flowed, without striking the step. When morning came, the people greeted him as usual, but some of them sensed that something had changed. The young leader's posture was the same. His gaze was the same. His tone of voice was the same. But the depth behind his eyes was different. This difference was the kind that steppe people immediately sensed intuitively. Before waking the people, the young leader took a long walk. The smell of the steppe that morning was different, fresher, more open, clearer. Even the clouds in the sky seemed to symbolize the beginning of a new age, slightly dispersed. He gathered the community again in the great circle. Everyone silent, everyone attentive, everyone curious. When the young leader began to speak, his voice seemed to have shifted to a rhythm harmonious with the wind. The steppe has opened a path for us. This sentence created a stir within the people, because such sentences were not used in ordinary conversations. When the sign of the steppe came, people would immediately understand it. The young leader continued. Now we will build a path not just for ourselves, but for the entirety of the steppe. With these words, the people were enveloped in a deep silence. This silence was not of fear, but of awareness. The young leader prepared his people for several days. Not just defense, this was preparation for order, unity, direction, and vision. He explained one by one the migration routes, water sources, routes of animal herds, positions of pacified tribes. Everyone was witnessing for the first time a leader thinking not only of the community, but of the entire steppe. The nights were again long, calm, and filled with the sounds of wind. While children slept, the young leader walked among the tents, listening to the sound of nature, following the signs drawn by the sky. Every night, Asena's presence was felt, but not seen. This invisibility was not a separation, but a support, as if saying, "Now it's you." One morning, the young leader stood at the very center of the steppe. Behind him was his people. Before him was a wide and endless path. The wind caressed his hair. This caress was an invitation to begin. And at that moment, the young leader began to walk. The people followed him, step by step, silently, in harmony with nature's rhythm. This walk was not a migration. It was not a change. It was not a preparation for war. This walk was the birth of a nation. It was the merging of a leader's fate with his people. It was the uniting of the steppe's spirit with human breath. And, as the young leader walked, a howl rose from within. The sound did not come out but echoed in his heart. That howl was Asena's howl. The voice of the one who protected him as a child, who guided him as a youth, who chose him as a leader. A new age was beginning over the steppe, and the name of this age was no longer the breath of a single wolf. It was the breath of a people. As the story slowly closes here, your breath may also be matching the same rhythm. The steppe is wide, the wind is soft, the sound of night is deep. If sleep is calling you, you can allow it, because the steppe protects those who sleep. The path that opened before the young leader was not merely a road carved into the earth. It was a rhythm woven into the very fabric of time itself, a silent promise whispered through generations of wind and stone. As the community walked behind him, each step seemed to merge with the heartbeat of the steppe, creating a harmony that had been absent for countless seasons. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows that stretched across the grasslands like the fingers of ancient spirits reaching out to guide them. And in this half-light between night and day, the young leader felt the weight of his people's trust settling upon his shoulders, not as a burden, but as wings that might carry them all toward something greater than survival alone. Days passed in this manner, with the rhythm of walking becoming a meditation, a shared breath among the community. Children who had once played with wooden toys now learned to read the land itself, watching how their leader paused at certain points to smell the air, to touch the soil, to listen to sounds that seemed to come from beneath the earth rather than above it. The elders, who had lived through seasons of hardship and loss, recognized in the young leader's movements the same wisdom they had seen in the natural world. The patience of stone, the persistence of water, the knowing stillness of a wolf before it moves. And in recognizing this, they understood that their journey was not simply from one place to another, but from one way of being to another entirely. The young leader spoke little during these days, for he had learned from Asena that silence often carried more truth than words. But when the evening fires were lit, and the community gathered in circles that mirrored the great circle of the horizon itself, he would sometimes share fragments of the vision that guided him. He spoke of a steppe where different tribes could move like currents in a river, each maintaining its own character while contributing to a greater flow. He described gathering places where knowledge could be exchanged as freely as trade goods, where the wisdom of one group might strengthen another. These were not merely dreams spoken into the firelight. They were possibilities he had seen reflected in Asena's eyes, ancient patterns waiting to be remembered rather than invented. One evening, as the community rested near a spring that bubbled up from deep within the earth, an old woman approached the young leader. Her face was a map of years, each line a story of survival, and when she spoke, her voice carried the texture of wind through dry grass. She asked him a question that had been growing in the minds of many. "Young one, you speak of gathering the scattered peoples of the steppe, but what will hold them together when the wind blows hard and each wishes to go their own way?" The young leader looked at the spring, watching how the water emerged from darkness into light, how it flowed without forcing, how it found its path by yielding rather than pushing. He replied, "What holds water in a spring is not walls, but the earth itself, the shape of the land, the natural order. We will not bind people with chains of obligation, but create a shape, a pattern that feels like home to the spirit. Just as this spring does not command the water to rise, yet the water rises anyway." The old woman nodded slowly, and in her nod was the acknowledgement that perhaps this young one, raised by a wolf, understood things that those raised only among humans might never grasp. That night, as people settled into sleep, the wind carried a howl from somewhere far away, and though most were already dreaming, the young leader sat awake, listening. The howl was not Asena's alone. It was a chorus, as if the steppe itself had found its voice. In that sound, he heard both a blessing and a warning. The path he walked was correct, but it would not be easy, and there would come moments when even he might doubt whether the vision was real or merely a dream born of wishful hope. The next morning brought with it a change in the weather. Clouds gathered in the west, not the heavy gray of storm, but the lighter shade that promised gentle rain. The young leader observed this and decided they would remain at the spring for another day, allowing the coming rain to bless both the land and their journey. As the first drops began to fall, soft as whispers, the children ran out to feel the water on their faces, and their laughter rose like birds taking flight. The young leader watched them and thought of how a people's future lived not in grand plans, but in such moments of simple joy, in the sound of children who felt safe enough to play in the rain. During that day of rest, something unexpected occurred. A small group of riders appeared on the horizon, approaching slowly with a caution that suggested they were uncertain of their welcome. The young leader stood to receive them, flanked by his most trusted companions, but his posture was open rather than defensive. As the riders drew closer, it became clear they were from a tribe the community had never encountered before. Their clothing and the markings on their horses speaking of lands far to the east. Their leader, a woman with iron-gray hair bound in complex braids, dismounted and approached on foot, a gesture of respect that the young leader immediately recognized and honored by stepping forward to meet her halfway. Through careful exchange, speaking in the common language that all steppe peoples shared despite their differences, the story emerged. This tribe had heard rumors of a young leader who walked with the blessing of the wolf spirit, who spoke of a new way for the scattered peoples of the steppe. They had traveled many days to see if these rumors held truth, or were merely the wishful tales that sometimes drifted across the grasslands, like seeds on the wind. The young leader listened to their words, and in listening heard not just what they said, but what they carried beneath their words: weariness, hope, and the quiet desperation of people who had survived but were no longer certain what they were surviving for. That evening, the two groups shared fire and food, and in the sharing began the slow work of building trust. The young leader did not speak of his vision as a grand plan or a destiny that must be fulfilled. Instead, he spoke of simple things, of how the steppe taught patience, of how wolves understood that the pack's strength came not from dominating each member, but from allowing each to contribute their unique gifts. The gray-haired woman listened with eyes that seemed to look past the surface of things, and when the night grew deep and most had fallen asleep, she remained by the fire with the young leader, speaking in low tones about the patterns she had seen in her own long life. She told him of tribes that had grown strong through conquest only to crumble from within, of alliances built on mutual fear that dissolved the moment the fear passed, of leaders who had inspired their people to great deeds but had not taught anyone else to lead, so that when they died, their accomplishments died with them. She spoke these things not as criticism, but as observation, as one might describe the shapes of clouds or the flow of rivers. And then she asked him the question that cut to the heart of everything. What will outlast you? What will remain when you are dust and your name is just another story told by firelight? The young leader felt the weight of this question settle into his bones, and he knew that he had no complete answer, only the beginning of one. The sense that what he was building must somehow be woven into the land itself, into the rhythm of seasons and the memory of the steppe, so that it would continue whether he was there to guide it or not. The rain continued through the night, gentle and persistent, and by morning the steppe had transformed into a place of renewed life. Grass that had been brown now showed hints of green. The spring flowed more abundantly, and the air carried a freshness that made breathing itself feel like a gift. The eastern tribe decided to travel with the young leader's community for a time, to see with their own eyes whether the vision he spoke of could take root in the hard soil of reality. As they prepared to continue the journey, the young leader noticed that the way people moved together had changed subtly. There was less separation between us and them, more curiosity than caution, more questions asked and stories shared. In the days that followed, the combined group moved across the steppe like a living thing, adapting to the land's contours, finding the paths that seemed to open naturally before them. They encountered other travelers, some of whom joined them for a few days before continuing on their own paths, others who stayed, drawn by something they could not quite name but felt nonetheless. The young leader watched this organic growth with wonder and sometimes with apprehension, for he understood that what was forming was beyond his control, that it had its own life and would follow its own course, and he could only hope to guide it gently, like steering a horse with the lightest touch, rather than forcing it with bit and rein. One afternoon, as they crested a rise, the young leader saw something that made his breath catch. In the valley below, spread across the grassland like a great gathering of stars fallen to earth, were camps of many different tribes, each distinct in its arrangement, but all oriented toward a central space where fires burned and people moved like water finding its level. This was not a place he had led them to deliberately. Rather, it seemed the land itself had drawn them here, as if the steppe had been waiting for this moment, this convergence. The gray-haired woman rode up beside him and said quietly, "The earth remembers what we have forgotten. This place has called gatherings before." As they descended into the valley, the young leader felt Asena's presence more strongly than he had since that night of vision. It was not a physical presence, but something deeper, a knowing that threaded through everything like the roots of grass binding the soil. He understood then that his role was not to create something entirely new, but to help remember something ancient, a pattern that had always existed in the bones of the steppe, but had been obscured by generations of conflict and scattering. What he was doing was not building, but uncovering, not inventing, but recognizing. The gathering that formed in that valley over the following days was unlike anything most of the people had witnessed in their lifetimes. Tribes that had been strangers or even enemies found themselves sharing meals, trading goods, exchanging songs and stories. Children played together without regard for which camp they had come from, and in their play was the future taking shape, a generation that might see the steppe not as divided territories, but as a single home with many rooms. The young leader moved among the camps, listening more than speaking, and when he did speak, it was to draw connections, to point out how one tribe's strength might complement another's need, how knowledge could flow between them like water-finding channels. Yet, even in this time of gathering and hope, the young leader sometimes walked alone into the darkness beyond the fires, needing to feel the older silence, the voice of the steppe itself beneath the human voices. On one such night, as he stood at the valley's edge looking up at the stars that seemed so close he might touch them, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he found himself face to face with a young warrior from a distant tribe, someone who had been watching him with suspicious eyes since arriving. The warrior's hand rested on his knife, not threateningly, but with readiness, and his voice when he spoke was tight with challenge. "Why should we trust you? What makes you different from any other leader who promises unity but seeks only power?" The young leader did not answer immediately. He turned back to look at the stars and, after a long silence, said, "I was raised by a wolf. I know what it is to be saved by something that had no obligation to save me, to be taught by something that owed me nothing. Everything I learned from watching, from listening, from being part of something larger than myself. I do not ask you to follow me. I ask you to remember what the steppe has always known, that we are strongest when we move like the wind, separate but part of the same breath." The warrior stood silent for a long moment, then slowly removed his hand from his knife. He did not speak again, but he did not leave either, and together they stood watching the night until the young warrior finally turned and walked back toward the fires, his shoulders somehow lighter than they had been. As the gathering continued, certain patterns began to emerge naturally. People organized hunts together, combining their different techniques to bring down game that no single tribe could have managed alone. They established rotating watches so that all could sleep safely, sharing the burden of vigilance. They created a space where disputes could be brought and discussed openly, not ruled upon by any single authority, but worked through until all parties felt heard. These were small things, practical arrangements born of necessity, but in them the young leader saw the seeds of something more enduring than any law or decree could ever be. On the 7th night of the gathering, as the moon rose full and bright, painting the valley in silver light, a ceremony spontaneously emerged. It began with a single drum, its rhythm echoing the heartbeat of the earth itself, and then others joined with their own instruments, with voices, with the stamping of feet. The young leader found himself drawn into the circle that formed, moving with others in a dance that was both ancient and being created in that very moment. As he danced, he felt the boundaries of his individual self beginning to blur, felt himself becoming part of the larger whole, and in that moment of surrender, he understood what Asena had been trying to teach him all along, that true strength comes not from standing apart, but from knowing how to be both separate and connected, like wolves in a pack, like grass in the wind. The dance continued until exhaustion claimed the dancers one by one, until they lay on the earth beneath the stars, breathing hard but breathing together, hearts synchronized to a rhythm older than memory. The young leader lay among them, and as sleep began to pull him down into its embrace, he heard it again, the howl. But this time, it came not from outside, but from within, from the very center of his being, and he understood that Asena had never left him, that the wolf spirit was not something external to be followed, but something internal to be embodied, and in embodying it, he became a bridge between the human world and the wild wisdom that humans so often forgot. As your breath slows and deepens, matching the rhythm of the steppe's own breathing, perhaps you feel the weight of your body settling more completely into rest, the way the earth accepts all who lie upon it. The story continues, as stories do, weaving through the darkness like a path you can follow with your eyes closed. And if sleep comes now, let it come gently, like rain on thirsty ground. The morning after the great dance found the valley wrapped in a mist so thick that the camps seemed to float in a world between earth and sky, a place where the boundaries of the ordinary had grown thin and uncertain. The young leader woke with the echo of the drum still resonating in his chest, and, As he emerged from his tent, he noticed that others moved with a similar quality of being, not quite fully returned to their everyday selves, as if the ceremony had opened a door in their spirits that had not yet completely closed. This was good, he thought, for a people too firmly rooted in the mundane could not dream, and without dreams there could be no path to follow into the future. As the mist began to lift, drawn upward by the sun's patient warmth, the young leader walked through the camps observing how the different tribes had begun to intermingle in ways that would have been unthinkable even a week before. He saw a woman from the eastern tribe teaching children from 3 other groups how to weave grass into patterns that could predict the weather, her gnarled fingers moving with a grace that belied their age, and the children watching with the kind of attention that only the young can bring when they sense they are being given something precious. He saw men comparing arrow designs, not with the competitiveness of warriors, but with the curiosity of craftsmen who recognize that every approach holds some wisdom worth understanding. These were small moments, easily overlooked, but the young leader had learned from Asena that the largest truths often wore the smallest faces. Yet, even as the gathering grew more harmonious, the young leader felt an undercurrent of something unresolved, a question that no one was quite asking aloud, but that moved through the camps like wind through grass. What happens next? The gathering could not last forever. The steppe was too vast, the seasons too demanding, the rhythms of migration too deeply ingrained in the people's blood. They could not all simply stay in this valley, living off the land that was meant to support far fewer, and yet if they scattered back to their separate paths, would anything of what they had built together remain, or would it dissolve like morning mist? The young leader carried this question with him as he continued his walk, and it grew heavier with each step until he found himself at the valley's edge, looking out across the endless grassland that rolled toward the horizon like frozen waves on a great green sea. Here, away from the camps and the voices, he could hear the steppe speaking in its own language of rustling grass and distant bird calls and the subtle shifts in the wind's direction. He stood so still that a small ground squirrel emerged from its burrow near his feet, unafraid, going about its business of gathering seeds as if he were just another part of the landscape. This, too, was a teaching, that sometimes the greatest power lies in becoming so still, so present, that even the timid creatures of the earth recognize you as belonging. He did not know how long he stood there, only that when he finally heard footsteps approaching, the sun had moved a hand's width across the sky. Turning, he saw the gray-haired woman from the eastern tribe, along with several others who had emerged as natural leaders of their respective groups. They had come, they said, to seek counsel, though the young leader suspected they had really come to offer it, to share the burden of decision-making that must now be faced. Together they sat on the grass at the valley's edge, and for a time no one spoke, as if they all understood that some decisions could not be rushed, that wisdom required the space of silence in which to grow. Finally, it was the gray-haired woman who spoke, her voice carrying the weight of years but also a lightness, an acceptance of uncertainty that came only with age. She said, "We have created something beautiful here, something that warms the heart to witness. But beauty alone cannot sustain a people. The children must eat, the herds must graze, the seasons must be respected. We cannot preserve this moment like a butterfly trapped in amber. We can only honor it by letting it change into what it needs to become." Others nodded at these words, and one by one they began to share their thoughts, not as pronouncements but as offerings laid before the group for consideration. Through this exchange, a pattern began to emerge, not imposed from above, but woven from the contributions of many voices. They spoke of creating regular gatherings, not constantly, but at certain times of the year when the land could support large numbers and when the tribes would naturally be moving through areas where their paths might cross. They discussed establishing shared signs that any tribe could recognize, ways of marking water sources and good grazing lands and places of danger, so that knowledge gained by one group could benefit all. They imagined a network of messengers who might travel between tribes carrying news and knowledge, young people who could learn many dialects and customs, becoming bridges between different ways of living. These were practical ideas, born from the reality of life on the steppe, but underlying them was a more profound shift. The understanding that the tribes were not separate entities competing for scarce resources, but parts of a larger whole, like organs in a body, each necessary for the health of all. As the discussion continued, the young leader listened more than he spoke, offering thoughts only when the conversation seemed to circle back on itself, or when he sensed that people were holding back from saying what they truly felt. He had learned this, too, from watching Asena, that a leader who speaks too much creates followers who listen too little. But a leader who makes space for others' voices creates a community that can think for itself. And yet, there were moments when his contribution proved crucial, particularly when old grievances or suspicions threatened to derail the conversation. For he had a gift for reframing conflicts not as battles to be won, but as problems to be solved together, as puzzles that required the pieces all parties held. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, something resembling a covenant had taken shape among those gathered at the valley's edge. It was not written down, for most of the people could not read and write, and besides, the most sacred agreements were kept in the heart rather than on animal skin or bark. But it was spoken aloud, each leader voicing their tribe's commitment to this new way of being, and in the speaking it became real, more solid than if it had been carved in stone. They agreed to meet again in this valley when the moon completed 4 full cycles, and to spread the word to other tribes, they encountered that there was a new pattern emerging on the steppe, an old pattern being remembered, and all were welcome to become part of it who wished to live in balance rather than in endless struggle. As they rose to return to the camps, the young leader felt a lightness in his chest, as if something that had been clenched tight had finally relaxed. He looked out across the steppe once more and seemed to see it differently now, not as a vast emptiness to be endured, but as a living presence that held all its people in its ancient embrace. The grass that bent beneath the wind was not broken by it, but made stronger, its roots growing deeper with each season's storms. Perhaps, he thought, this was the true teaching, that flexibility was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. That evening's gathering around the fires was different from previous nights. There was less of the excited discovery that comes when strangers first encounter each other, and more of the comfortable familiarity that grows between those who have worked together toward a common purpose. Stories were still shared, but they were personal rather than legendary, people speaking of their own lives and struggles with a vulnerability that would have been impossible at the gathering's beginning. The young leader listened to these stories and felt his heart expanding to hold them, all, each narrative, a thread that wove him more tightly into the fabric of his people. An elder from a northern tribe, a man so old his age was beyond counting, spoke of a time in his youth when the tribes had warred constantly, when no one could move across the steppe without fear, when mothers taught their children to be silent because crying might attract raiders. He spoke of burying his own children, of winters so hard that choices had to be made about who would eat and who would starve. His voice did not break as he told these things, but his eyes held a depth of sorrow that silence alone could not convey. And then he said, "I never thought I would live to see a time like this, when different tribes could sit together without weapons drawn, when children could play without fear. Whatever comes after, I will die having witnessed this, and that is enough to make the long, hard years worth enduring." These words settled over the gathering like a blanket, warming something that cold could not touch, and the young leader understood that what they were creating was not just a political arrangement or an economic alliance, but a healing of wounds so deep that many had forgotten they still carried them. This was Asena's gift, he realized. Not just the preservation of his life as a child, but the shaping of him into someone who could help create a space where such healing might occur. The wolf had seen in him not what he was, but what he might become, and in seeing it had made it possible. Later, when most had drifted off to sleep and the fires had burned down to glowing coals, the young leader sat alone, or so he thought until he noticed a small figure approaching from the shadows. It was a child, a girl perhaps 7 or 8 years old, from one of the smaller tribes that had joined the gathering late. She came and stood before him with the directness that children have before they learn to be afraid of those in authority. And she said, "My grandmother says you talk to wolves. Is it true?" The young leader smiled and gestured for her to sit beside him. He looked up at the stars and said, "I knew a wolf once when I was young. She taught me many things, though not with words. Do you know what the most important thing was?" The girl shook her head, her eyes wide and reflecting the coal's dying light. "She taught me that we are all connected, that the wolf and the human and the grass and the sky are all part of one great breathing thing. And when we remember this, we can never be truly alone." The girl considered this gravely, then nodded as if he had confirmed something she had already suspected. She stood and started to leave, then turned back and said, "I think your wolf was very wise." She was, the young leader agreed. She is. When the girl had gone, the young leader remained by the coals, feeling the night deepen around him like a pool of water into which he might sink without ever reaching bottom. From somewhere far away came the howl he had been half expecting all evening, and this time it was answered by another howl, and then another, a conversation carried out across vast distances in a language older than words. He listened to this wild singing, and felt his own throat tighten with the desire to join his voice to theirs, to add his note to the ancient song. He did not howl aloud, for that might have alarmed the sleeping camps, but in his heart he howled with them, and in that moment the boundaries between human and animal, between self and other, grew thin as mist and just as impossible to hold. The next several days were spent in preparation for departure, for though the gathering had been profound, all understood that it could not be permanent, that the steppe required movement and change as much as it required rest. The young leader helped organize the dispersal, ensuring that each tribe had what it needed for the journey ahead. That knowledge had been shared about the territories each would traverse, that agreements about the next gathering were clearly understood. It was detailed work, the kind that required patience and attention to small matters, and the young leader threw himself into it with the understanding that visions meant nothing if they could not be translated into the practical realities of daily life. On the last morning, as the camps began to fold like flowers closing at dusk, the young leader stood with the gray-haired woman and several other tribal leaders, exchanging final words and farewells. There was sadness in these partings, but also hope, the knowledge that they were not saying goodbye forever, but only until the moon had completed its cycles and drew them back together. The woman placed her hand on the young leader's shoulder and said, "You have given us something to believe in beyond mere survival. That is a rare gift." He shook his head and replied, "We have given it to each other. I am only a mirror that reflects what was always there." As the tribes began to move out in their different directions, the valley slowly emptied, and by midday it seemed as if the gathering had never been, as if it had been a dream dreamed by the land itself. But the young leader knew better. He could feel the change in the earth beneath his feet, in the quality of the air, in the way the grass seemed to hold an echo of all the footsteps that had passed over it. The steppe remembered, and in remembering, it would guide those who came after to find this place again. His own tribe was among the last to leave, and as they climbed out of the valley, the young leader turned back once more to look at the space that had held so much. He saw movement at the valley's far edge, a shape that might have been a wolf or might have been merely a shadow cast by clouds across the sun. He watched until his eyes could no longer distinguish details, and then he turned away, facing forward toward the path ahead, toward whatever the future might hold, ready to meet it with the patience and attention Asena had taught him all those years ago in a cave that now seemed to belong to another lifetime entirely. Your breathing has perhaps grown deeper now, more regular, following a rhythm that needs no conscious guidance. The story surrounds you like darkness, not frightening but comforting, a gentle weight that presses you down into rest. If your eyes have grown heavy, let them close. The steppe will still be there when you wake.